Hello world. Today I'm going to be making a reaction video on a video made by a YouTuber named Christian Watson, who made a video about a proposal made by Vivek Ramaswamy. A coworker and myself had a conversation about this topic because we are both high school history teachers here in the state of Arizona, where you do in fact have to pass a civics test in order to graduate from a public high school. And I saw that Christian had made a video on this topic. I know of him through a mutual acquaintance, and we did have some email correspondence a couple years back that fizzled out for whatever reason. But I am hoping that this might spark some new conversation between us. Without further ado, let's get started on Christian's video.
Every society has its own set of sacred cows. For the ancient Greeks, it was the Greek gods that sat upon Mount Olympus and were responsible for the functions of the natural world. For the ancient Egyptians, it was the principle of Ma'at, which was this sort of universal cosmic law that governs everything and binds everything and by which they're supposed to live. For the Romans, it was the gladiators and this sort of idea of virility and strength exercised through culture and architecture and all that kind of stuff. And for America, amongst many sacred cows that we have in this great land, we have the idea of voting rights, the incorrect idea of voting rights that so many people take for granted and never critically examine. And when it is examined, people recoil because once again, sacred cows have an emotional affection to us. And there's no better example in recent times of this sacred cow showing itself and its supporters showing itself than when Vivek Ramaswamy, the president's candidate in 2023-4.
So as we can see here, and to put it generally, Christian is a philosophy guy. He's working on an undergraduate degree in philosophy, I believe. And when he gets on these topics, he has a tendency to talk kind of fast. So in my reaction, I'm going to focus on the political aspects of this video.
So announced he wanted to raise the voting age to 25 in America on the condition that you either pass a civics test or you complete at least 6 months of service in the military or the police force or other kind of public service. I'll let him explain his idea to you right here.
That is why today I'm announcing my support for a new amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That amendment would raise the voting age in this country from 18 to 25, but still tell you that you can vote at 18 if you either do service to this country 6 months in the military or 6 months as a first responder, or else at least pass the same civics test that we make an immigrant pass to actually become a voting citizen in this country.
All right. So unfortunately, the amendment process in this country is all but broken. The last amendment to pass was in 1992, and it doesn't look like any are going to pass anytime soon. And ultimately, it's just not an effective way to enact policy.
Now, of course, many of you could probably guess that this elicited a wide range of responses. In fact, I show you here on the screen all these different newspapers attacking him and saying that this is a wrong idea. Even conservative newspapers like Washington Examiner saying this is a bad idea, this is the wrong idea, this will alienate Gen Z voters. And the arguments proposed by critics of Ramaswamy's plan tend to go as follows. I actually list a few of them out. Number one, Ramaswamy disenfranchises young people by doing this. Number two, Ramaswamy does not win youth voters by doing this. And number three, this policy is an assault on democracy. Those are the three main arguments. There are perhaps more arguments. Those are the ones that I have seen in the mainline publications and the ones I have seen while scrolling on social media.
So Christian didn't mention the argument I laid out about the amendment process, which I am hoping can be a topic for conversation for us.
Now, I can go in and tell you why each of those arguments are wrong, or I can do something more important. I can actually explain to all of you why the idea of voting rights is not correct. And then once I have destroyed that beast, tie that into why I think Ramaswamy's idea of how voting should be conducted is correct. So let me do that first before we get into the specifics. So you have to ask ourselves something. If we're going to analyze the idea of voting rights, you must ask yourself something. What is a right? Most people cannot give you an answer on this. Someone would say it's something you're entitled to. Others would say that's something you deserve. Many people don't have moral clarity on this issue, which is a problem in America. In a country built upon the idea that the individual has rights, and these rights put a limitation on society and the government on their behavior, you should have people who understand what that is. So a right, my friends, in the current understanding that we have, in the classical understanding, and the understanding that shaped our country, is something that belongs to you, not merely a thing that is temporary, but something that literally belongs to you as a human being. This is the idea of natural rights. So let me go take you through a little bit of history here.
So this is where he dives pretty deep into the history of rights through a philosophical lens. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. If you want to see this part of the video, it will be linked in the description. But he's going to summarize his thoughts right here where we pick up.
Believes in that justice is a matter of distribution or redistribution, so to speak. So the idea of rights, just to summarize everything I just said, rights are things that belong to you, that are the prerequisites for life, that must exist for A, human life to flourish, and B, society to function.
You know, a lot of people think that in order to conceal carry, you're going to need a tactical belt and a set of jeans. Well, I'm here to tell you that you don't.
Those are what rights are. And these are a very specific set of things that are integral to your human nature. This is why the idea of natural rights, as Locke put it, life, liberty, and property, are so integral. Because without life, liberty doesn't matter. Without liberty, you can't really be held account for your actions, and you can't really govern your own actions by your own will, and therefore you can't be a human being, because to be a human being is to act in a world in which you can use your conscience and your reason to act within. With liberty gone, you can't do that. And property, if you cannot own something, you cannot survive. If man was not able to own what he has, there would be a free stake, a free claim to take what he has. But property, which is endemic to us, we own ourselves, actually safeguards this. So also, that's what rights are. Rights are moral.
All right, so at this point, Christian has laid out his basic understanding of what rights are, and the rest of this video is going to rely on the assumption that his definition is accurate, and ultimately going to lead to him contradicting himself.
Moral principles that are integral to human life, human existence, that we cannot survive without. That's what rights are. Now, let's put this in the context of voting rights, right? Voting rights are merely an emotional phrase created with a flawed idea of rights. Voting rights comes from this idea of positive rights, the idea that rights are not things that belong to you as a human being. They are instead things that are granted to you by a society: a right to health care, a right to electricity, a right to be free from poverty, a right to material wealth. These are the sort of ideas that go under the umbrella of positive rights. But really, positive rights cannot be rights Because if rights are something that actually belong to you as a human being, and all those things are merely commodities or resources, then those things, calling those things rights, are actually a category error, number one. And number two, those things are not rights, they are privileges because they can be taken away by the person who gives them to you.
So this is where he starts to contradict himself and mistakenly equate positive rights with privileges, because according to this logic, property would simply qualify as a privilege because it can in fact be taken away. So according to his logic, property would in fact be a privilege, but we know this is not the case. We don't have the privilege to own a firearm. We have the right to own a firearm. We don't have the privilege to vote. We have the right to vote. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. People don't fight for privileges. They generally fight for rights. The state's ability to either hinder or promote certain rights does not negate their status as rights.
So even the flawed idea of rights the left holds on to has to be able to deal with the problem of human limitations, and it has to be able to deal with the problem of self-ownership posed by the proper idea of rights. No one comes out of the womb with the right to a ballot box. So voting, necessarily so-called, is not a right per se. It is categorically a privilege. Now, many of you may balk at that and say, how dare you say that? That's not correct. And the reason why voting is associated with rights is because voting, the history of voting in America.
So the history of voting in America does actually go back to the Constitution. In Article 2, when they lay out the Electoral College, they reference the right to vote, not the privilege to vote. The 15th Amendment uses the phrase right to vote as well. So it's really the history of voting rights in America can be traced back to our foundational documents.
Is marked with so much emotional turmoil and social chaos that people have an affection towards the idea of voting, so much so that it prevents them from being able to see the concept for what it is. Be wary of illusions that take you away from the true nature of things, because those illusions will impair your understanding of important topics like voting.
So this is where he starts to basically make the argument that leftists are just an irrational group incapable of understanding how voting works.
Many will point to the voting rights movement of the 1960s and say, well, if people back then were trying to vote, but the racists were trying to stop them from voting, therefore voting is a right. No, voting is a privilege. Even if bad people try to revoke the privilege that you so have, it doesn't make it a right. It's a privilege. No matter how much emotional significance you attach to the idea of voting, it is a privilege. Now, it's a privilege in the context of our constitutional system. You see, a constitutional republic is under a different moral framework and standard than this idea of a democracy. A democracy is a utilitarian hell. It is an abstraction that cannot exist and devolves into majoritarian tyranny, whereas a republic is an ordered system of government that uses different parts of government and different bodies in government to sort of filter out the wild passions of the majority, and in doing so protect the minority and also secure individual rights. And at the same time, it has an internal regulation system on government itself. But of course,
so any real political scientist would balk at his conceptions of Republican and Democratic forms of government. He paints them as these dichotomous forms of government, when in reality, our constitutional republic operates through democratic institutions. That is the shorter way of saying what he just said.
of course, voters
So today, on this very moment,
have an integral part in that process, in that sort of self-regulation process. Because without voters, the republic cannot function in the way that it's meant to do as a balancing system. Now, here's the problem, though. Voting is merely a process against the backdrop of a broader idea. Many people don't vote to preserve the political system we have in its proper form. What we have right now in America is not a proper political system. What we have right now is a system ran by the administrative state, ran by three-letter agencies who routinely usurp the consent of the government, who routinely usurp popular sovereignty, who routinely usurp the will of the acts of Congress, who routinely usurp the functions of the executive branch, and who instead insert their own understanding of the Constitution of the government into that. Look at the Durham report. Look at.
So this is where he, once again, just dives off the deep end into conspiracy theory.
The fact that the FBI did indeed collude with certain political interests to smear President Trump, and look at the history of the FBI, the history of the CIA, running propaganda campaigns to convince the masses of things that actually don't exist, and that also influences public opinion, and that also influences the direction of the country. Like, there is a system in this country that literally manipulates every lever of society to its own ends. And that used to be called a conspiracy theory, but we actually know for a fact it's true. And it needs to change. Which is why I have to support Vivek, because Vivek is saying we got to shut these things down. So, but if people don't understand the first principles of a nation, how can they vote to preserve the nation? Understand this. If you are to drive a car, but you don't understand how to drive, how can you operate a car well? There is a function of a car, and there is a way to activate that function of a car. Now, think of a nation. America is built upon certain bedrock first principles.
So Christian here and our mutual acquaintance mentioned first principles in, I swear, nearly every video they make. So this is actually another topic of conversation that I hope Christian and I can dive deeper into.
That we see people disregarding every single day. And we see people voting for ideas, policies, and candidates that are contrary to these bedrock foundational principles of natural law, individualism, objective truth. How can the function of a process go against the process? Voting is a function of the process of popular sovereignty. But those who vote against American ideas actively go against America. Hence, it is important, as Vivek said, to have that civics requirement, to have a baseline knowledge of what you're going to vote for in order to vote and vote correctly. This is why I think Vivek's policy proposal is 100% warranted and 100% correct. Because Gen Z, according to Pew Research, overwhelmingly believes in leftist ideals that subvert the foundational ideas of America. And in doing so, every time they vote for candidates who also wish to subvert these fundamental ideas of America. And in doing so, destroy the republic.
All right. So unless you just absolutely agree with his concept and idea of foundational principles in America, ultimately all he's saying here is that he doesn't want Gen Z to vote because they vote left.
Educating people on what it means to be an American, which is not merely a statistical category given to you by the Census Bureau, but it is instead a statement of philosophical moral values. Educating people on what that actually means enriches the republic and ensures that government functions how it's supposed to. Now, of course, there are people who can take the test just to take it and get the requirement out of the way and not care whatsoever. The test is not magical. None of this is magical. But all this is an attempt to preserve what we have, the little bit of what we have left in this country. Jefferson said that a society, he would rather have a society of newspapers without government. And Jefferson is interesting because Jefferson didn't like the partisan press whatsoever. Basically, I'd rather have a society of newspapers without government than government without newspapers. Jefferson believed that the enlightened society would be able to maintain civilization. But right now, we don't have an enlightened society. We have a society where people go on college campuses and they get punched out for being conservative. We have a society where people in corporate boardrooms are being taught that capitalism is racist and they are racist if they're white. We have a society where up is down and down is up. We have a society where children can be transitioned and mutilated with surgery at an early age because they feel a certain way and their parents go ahead with it. We have a society where children can be paraded in front of men doing sexual exhibitionist practices, which in any other context is immoral and flat out wrong. We have a society where our moral education has declined so much so that you're seeing the consequences of that happen in everyday life.
So I don't think it takes a whole lot of objective analysis to see that Christian is basically just rambling about conspiracy at this point.
And if all of that is going downhill, if we've lost our proper sense of ethics and enlightenment, then it makes sense that our political system will follow, and it has followed. It continues to follow. We have a government where the president has no problem attempting to force Americans to take a vaccine. That's what Joe Biden tried to do. We have a government where the president has no problem using sanctions as a means of disrupting Americans' buying habit and destroying the global economy in the name of a conflict that has nothing to do with America, in the name of benevolence. We have a government where the administrative state almost controls every single operation of that government and then tries to convince the folks that it does not. We have a problem here, people. And the only way we escape it is if we restore that Jeffersonian sentiment that enlightenment is the prerequisite and the maintenance agent of civilization. And one of the ways you do that is by breaking these sacred cows and by speaking the truth and speaking it frankly. Voting is not a right. It is a privilege. It is a privilege with a particular end. And that end is to preserve the constitutional system. If you have no knowledge of American intellectual tradition, if you have no knowledge of American natural law philosophy, if you have no knowledge of the first principles that gave birth to the greatest paragon of human freedom that has ever existed in this world, then you cannot vote properly. You will only vote to destroy that system, to destroy that paragon, and to defy those principles. That's why I support Vivek's proposal to not only raise the voting age, but to have a civics requirement for people to.
So I do actually teach a unit on the principles of democracy, which might sound like blasphemy to Christian, but once again, I think this would be a great topic of conversation for us.
A certain age. In my opinion, you should go further. There should be a civics requirement for people of every age, in my opinion, because unfortunately, this menace we are seeing ripping across American society is on multiple levels. It transcends just one group, although it is being pushed greatly through Gen Z, my generation. So my friends, embrace enlightenment, study philosophy, and do not let sacred cows abuse you or mislead you, because the truth is so much more fulfilling and so much greater and so much more practical than the abstract ideas we hold dear. My friends, love you guys so much. If you love me, support me on my Patreon, on my locals, on this channel, like this video.
All right. So in the minimal amount of research that I did to make this video, to do this reaction, I found an article on fairvote.org called Voting a Right, a Privilege, or a Responsibility. And just a trigger warning for you, Christian, if you do actually watch this, the author refers to our country as a democracy. But I feel like this quote will be a good conclusion. We will end where we started, addressing the question, is the ability to vote more of a right, a privilege, or a responsibility? One's answer forces you to make a moral judgment and think about the nature of our democracy. Should the ability to vote be considered a privilege, thereby allowing disenfranchisement of certain groups of voters, or a right granted to as many people as legally possible? For us, the answer is clear. Respect for every vote and every voice means that while we honor voting and our nation's heroes, we oppose the government having the power to infringe upon our fundamental right to elect our representatives and exercise our voice through our vote.